Jody Bachelder, author of Here First, Samoset and the Wawenock of Pemaquid, Maine, presented about her book at the Liberty Library on November 10, 2022.
Thanks for having me. I know I've never been to the Liberty Library before, so I'm excited to be here. I wish I could have seen it in the light of day. That would have been even better. But thanks for coming out, and hello to the Zoom audience. If we ever have any technical glitches, just put something in the chat and Barb is here and we'll get it fixed. All right. So we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm sure you've probably seen and heard these before. As you know, this is indigenous land. Indigenous people have lived here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, taking care of this land, taking care of the resources sustainably. I'm going to be talking tonight mostly about the Pemaquid area, which is Pemaquid was one of the Wawenock tribes. And right now we're in Liberty, and we were talking about this earlier. This area is a little bit harder to pin down, I think, and I'll talk about it in a minute. But if you're in Augusta, you are probably on the ancestral homeland of the Kennebec. As I talk tonight, you'll see why it's kind of so difficult to place where the tribes actually were and who was living where. All right. But if you ever have any doubts about that, feel safe using the term Wabanaki. Wabanaki is sort of an umbrella term for all the indigenous people who live here, and that's a safe term to use. That's the acceptable term today. Okay, so I just want to tell you a little bit about how I came to be here tonight, because I'm not a historian, as I said, librarian by training. My connection to Samoset is geographic. We both grew up in the Pemaquid Peninsula. And about 6 years ago, we had a change in circumstances. My husband had a different job, so I got a little uprooted, and I thought, well, what the heck? I'll try writing a book. I always thought I would give it a shot. But the funny thing is, I thought I was going to write a picture book for children about Samoset. I thought there was very little information to find about him. And once I started to dig, though, once I started to do the research, I realized there's actually a lot to find. And as soon as you start to put him in the context of when he lived, which was around 1590 to 1653, that's a bit of a guess, but then you start to see just how important that time period was and what was going on. And there was a lot going on in Pemaquid for sure. So it became a huge story. And so I thought I need to at least try this. So what happened when the English came to Maine? So anyway, that's what I'm going to delve into tonight was, and what was that relationship like between the English and the Wabanaki? And how did that kind of all go so wrong? I just want to take a second to say that I recognize that as a descendant of European colonizers who probably displaced the Wabanaki, I may not be the best person to tell this story, unfortunately, but the Wawenock don't live there anymore. That's the story hadn't been told for 400 years. So I decided I would tackle it and at least get the conversation started. Let's get the story out there into the world. So I thought it would be helpful, you can see that good, to start with a map of Wabanaki country. Just so we can get our bearings. You are probably familiar with the fact that the Wabanaki means, translated in English, means the Dawnland, and the Wabanaki are the people of the Dawnland, or the people of the first light, so where the sun rises. And the people are the Micmac, which you can see on the east. They had a huge territory, Nova Scotia, all the way up north of, along the St. Lawrence. And then you have the Maliseet, who live along the St. John River, and the Passamaquoddy are down east. And then you have the Penobscot along the Penobscot River and originally along Penobscot Bay. And then you have all the other people living in Wabanaki territory, which was Western Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, just a little bit of Massachusetts. And there were many tribes in this area. The Wawenock were just one of those tribes. The Kennebec would have been another of them. And these people are collectively referred to as the Abenaki. And I know that's confusing. I know I was confused about that. So basically the Abenaki are sort of a subset and one of the Wabanaki tribes, if that makes sense to you. I think the term Wabanaki kind of came into being in the late 1600s. They all came together in a confederacy because there were Mohawk coming into Maine. They were looking for beaver. They had overhunted their beaver. Fur trade was a big thing. And so these tribes decided the only way to defeat the Mohawk were to band together. And that's sort of where the Wabanaki Confederacy started. So Samoset was a Wawenock, as I said, and he lived in Pemaquid. So that's number 15 on this map. I didn't make the map, but it was handy that it had the number right there. So this is Wawenock territory, which is basically from the Kennebec River on the west to around the St. George River on the east. So we were talking about liberty. Liberty, this is a difficult gray area, I think. My impression was that Wawenock territory expanded as far as the rivers did, because they would, I mean, that was their route of transportation. So north of that, which Liberty is, I think is a bit of a gray area. And I have seen writings that the Penobscot lived east and north of the Wawenock. So I would have said that this was Penobscot territory, but I know that that's.
Well, you do know that the Lake St. George, where the St. George's River originates, is less than a quarter mile away.
Okay, so,
And
that's possible.
The beginning of the river is
Yeah,
right
that,
down there in water,
true.
but it's not navigable.
Yeah, and the St. George, I think, again, is like this gray area. Was that Wawenock territory, really? Nobody knows for sure, and we'll kind of see why. But you can see by the map, by the geography, that the Wawenock were ocean and river people. I mean, that was what their country looked like. And I think Wawenock means people of the Bay Country. So the ocean, the lakes, the rivers were such a critical thing for the Wawenock, because they didn't build roads. It's really difficult to chop down all those trees. They got around by canoe. So they got around by paddling the ocean. They were incredibly skilled in their canoes, and we'll see, and paddling up the rivers, and they would carry their lightweight birch bark canoes when, there was the falls, or they needed, or the river ended and they needed to go somewhere else. So they could carry their canoes. That's how they got around. And they used these water sources for their food. So when the Europeans came and started damming up all the rivers, they had been filled with alewives and salmon and eels before that, which was a great source of food for indigenous people. And of course, ocean living people got so much of their food from the ocean, the shellfish, the cod, seals. They even hunted whales pretty incredibly. So they had a very, very healthy diet, which the Europeans were always quick to note how healthy they looked. Okay, so why did Europeans come here in the first place? Well, there were many reasons, but first of all, it was because they could. Technologies had improved, ship technology was better, the sails were better, so that allowed them to navigate better. They had now compasses, astrolabes, so they could navigate. Before these things, it was difficult for sailors to leave sight of land and hope that they'd find their way back. But with these instruments, they could get around better. They didn't have to depend so much navigating by the stars. And they had some incentive as well to leave and go exploring. They had permission, and I put that in quotes, to claim any land that they found that was not inhabited by other Christians. They could just go out and do that. And they could do this for whoever was sponsoring them, which was usually a king of some country. So they'd find the land, say, there are no Christians here, we can claim this for our country. And then they would receive some of the profits from that, receive a percentage or some other, lucrative gift or prize. So this permission, this entitlement that they felt they had, came from the Catholic Church, came from the popes. They issued a series of edicts, they called them papal bulls, which basically said, you may go out, as I said, and go out and take lands that are not inhabited by Christians, because, you know, we feel that they must be Christianized because our religion is the best. And this doctrine of discovery, as it's known today, sort of continues on to this day, because believe it or not, these edicts by the popes in the 1400s have never been rescinded. So they're technically still on the books. And I know that indigenous people have gone to the Pope Francis, tried to get him to rescind this. You know, I'm sure it's not used technically, but it's an insult that it's still on the books, so to speak. And for some reason, Pope Francis has not rescinded them. But this is a TED Talk I'd like to recommend. I think Mark Charles does a wonderful job of explaining the doctrine of discovery from the indigenous point of view. I found it really enlightening. And don't worry about, writing it down. I can tell you at the end how to get there. It's only about 17 minutes long, but I found it really worthwhile. Okay, so we know that Columbus sails west, of course, when he has all the tools at his disposal. And after he goes home and tells everybody about what he discovered, it opens the floodgates to the Americas, and other explorers start coming to the Americas. And they came for lots of reasons, but I would say that their main motivation was money. They were looking for gold and silver and other precious minerals. They were looking for this passage west to Asia. They were looking for a shorter way to get to Asia, because in the 1400s, it was a 2-year journey to go around Africa to get all those wonderful goods in Asia that they wanted, and they would never find that passage, of course. And then they were looking for natural resources that they no longer had at home because they overharvested them or depleted them. And I'm talking about things like timber. They cut down too many of their trees, whale oil for their lamps, and they were also looking for furs and fish. They'd overfish their cod, and furs were used, especially beaver furs were very valuable to the Europeans. They could make beaver fur into felt, and then the felt was made into hats. So hats, beaver felt hats were all the rage in Europe at the time. One of the explorers that came to Maine was an Englishman. His name was George Weymouth. He came in 1605, and he ended up in Mid-Coast, Maine. And he was looking for a location to build a colony. And he was also looking for some of those goods, because that would make him rich and it would make his investors rich. And anyway, he ended up in Muscongas Bay, which you can see on the map, and dropped anchor at the Georges Islands. So I've marked them by Allen Island being the largest. So this was Wawenock territory. And it's possible that this was the first time the Wawenock had actually met Europeans. We don't know for sure. But we're really lucky to have an account of this voyage, because a gentleman who was on the expedition, whose name was James Rosier, published a book about it. So we have an account of this. And I think it may be the very first time that anybody wrote about the Wawenock. And the first meeting that they had together was friendly. I don't think I can move this. Sorry. So 2 canoes, 6 men paddled out to the Georges Island. Now, that was 5 miles offshore. So in a birch bark canoe, again, as I said, they were incredibly skilled at being able to navigate in these waters. So they paddled out. They see this ship. They're really curious. They approach the ship and they try to communicate. And of course, they cannot. So James Rosier tosses a bundle of gifts down into the canoe, and they open it and they find peacock feathers and bells and trinkets and things. So they decide that these people mean to be friendly. And then they warmly welcome them. And they have some interesting encounters. And I love some of the things that James Rosier wrote about them. The fact that they loved candy, but they'd never had something sweet before. And they'd never seen their reflections in a mirror before. And when they did, they laughed and laughed and laughed. And I love how they made their clothing. Very practical, separate pieces. So they could, they tied on their sleeves, they tied on their leggings. they could take them off when they got hot. They did not have writing. That pretty much did not exist in the Americas before Europeans came. But they noticed that James Rosier was doing something that made him remember what they were saying. And so they were fascinated by it. Then Rosier asked if he can borrow one of their bows. He wants to try it out. And he mentions how expertly crafted it is. He said, this is the best bow I have ever used. And then he calls them a people of exceeding good invention, quick in understanding, and ready capacity. That's what it says under there. So in other words, he's calling them very intelligent people. And it's frustrating because in the next breath, he'll go on to call them savages. So of course, this is deliberate. This is the term that is used. It's meant to dehumanize indigenous people. It makes them seem somehow less worthy than the European Christians. And it's a tactic that Europeans used whenever they wanted to subjugate another group of people. They called the Irish savages too when they wanted to take over Ireland. So this is deliberate. So the Wawenock and the English, they met together for a few days in friendly gatherings. They ate together, they traded. The Wawenock brought tobacco and they had a smoke together. So that's kind of a bonding experience. And after a few days of this, the English kidnapped 5 of the men and took them to England. Yeah, it was kind of just like that. I don't think that the Wawenock were probably expecting it. They thought that after a few days of these nice meetings, that they had established a friendship with these people. So I think it was very unexpected. And I think that as a result, they were probably very easy prey.
Didn't even invite them?
Pardon me?
Didn't even invite them? Just kidnap them?
Well, it's kind of a long story. It's a really interesting story. The men were comfortable going on their ship at that point. So 3 of them went on the ship. So they were easy to kidnap. 3 others were on Allen Island. We think Allen Island. And they go over to the island. They bring a box of treasures, pretending they're going to trade with them. One gets suspicious and runs away. Was it Samoset? It is possible it could have been him. He would have been about old enough. He would have been about 15 years old. But one gets away, and then they just grab the other 2 and haul them off to the ship. So this was it's a violent encounter. They did not want to go. And in fact, you will see this from other explorers. It's sort of a pattern. Explorers would come, they would meet indigenous people, they would trade with them, they would pretend to be friends with them. And once they've let down their guard, then they would pounce and they would kidnap some. Now, many of these explorers would take them back to Europe to sell them as slaves. I mean, it was just a means to make money. I don't think that was the case with the 5 men who were kidnapped on Allen Island because of the way that they were used later. I think that they were meant to be used as guides and interpreters because the English had plans to come back. They were coming back to the area to build a colony. Okay, so there are the names of the 5 men who were kidnapped. Tahanado was actually the Sagamore, or the chief of Pemaquid. Okay, so they were taken first to the port city of Plymouth, England. 3 of them were left there, and then 2 were taken on to London. Now, these people were living basically a hunter-gatherer experience and using stone tools at this point. They had not moved into the field of using metal, shall we say. So this is a picture of what London looked like at the time. I mean, in my mind, this must have looked like a different planet to them. This was a city of about 250,000 people. It was a very sophisticated city this early. So they saw things that they had never seen before. Multi-story buildings, a fleet of ships, bridges. There were no bridges in their world. There were no large animals in their world. Horses, cows, sheep, goats did not exist in the Americas. They would have seen those for the first time here. But I just want to make one point, and that is that the English brought them there. They were pumping them for information. They wanted to know everything about, Maine, because they wanted to come back. But information's going both ways at this point. For those who were able to come back, and only 2 of the 5 ever make it back, they're learning a great deal too about their enemy, about the English. They are seeing how many there are. They are learning about their technologies. They're learning about their strengths and their weaknesses. So they are learning a lot as well, things that they couldn't have known if they had stayed at home. And when they came back, they would share that information far and wide, because the communication network among Indigenous people was incredibly vast. They shared information far and wide. Okay, so these 5 men were passed off to 2 Englishmen. The ones who stayed in Plymouth went to live with Sir Ferdinando Gorges, and you will hear that name again. And the other 2 went to live with Sir John Popham, and you probably recognize that name because he's the namesake of the Popham colony, which is the colony that they built in present-day Phippsburg. And what you see in this illustration is an interpretation. We don't know for sure how much of the colony they were able to build. Their plans were to build something like 50 buildings. They were only there for a year. So they did accomplish a great deal in the time they were there. And I want to point out in the lower right corner, I think you can see the ship under construction there. That's the Virginia. I don't know if you're familiar with the organization in Bath called Maine's First Ship. If you haven't heard of them, I hope you'll go to Bath sometime and check it out. There's an organization of volunteers. They spent 11 years building a replica of the Virginia, and it's absolutely incredible. They just launched her this June. She'll be docked in Bath for educational purposes, and it's really an amazing accomplishment to have done it. So good for them. But as for the colony itself, I mean, there were problems from the very start. They had poor leaders. They had insufficient supplies. They didn't bring enough food. And they arrived in August. And you can see this big garden that they supposedly built, but they arrived in August. So that didn't help. And the other thing is they really came with unrealistic expectations. They thought they were going to get rich finding gold and silver and spices. They thought they were going to find cinnamon and nutmeg here. We know that didn't work out. So the colony was doomed to fail, but it's a really, really interesting chapter in our history. And in the Wawenock's history, they were very integral to what was going on in that colony. And we're lucky again, because a journal was kept for the first 4 months of the colony's existence, and it still exists. One of the gentlemen on the expedition wrote about it. And in that journal, we learned that the Wawenock visited the colony at least twice. So I don't know if you've got a picture in your mind of how far down the coast that is, that they paddled their canoes from Pemaquid to Phippsburg, which is no easy feat. And they went twice. And I'll tell you, I got thinking to myself, I always kind of wondered why they didn't just run these people off. I mean, they have been betrayed, they've been kidnapped. Why didn't they just kill them? Why didn't they run them out? Of course, they had a good reason. Something I had never heard of was the Micmac War. And I don't know if you've ever heard of it either, but this was actually a really important war, not only in Wabanaki history, but in Maine history. I mean, I think we should be teaching this in our high schools. The Micmac War began in July of 1607. The Popham colony settlers arrived in August, so it had been going on already for a month before they came. And it's not, I don't think, an overstatement to say that this was literally a turning point for the Wabanaki people. You know, I'm sure they had engaged in war. You know, they're human beings, so I'm sure they fought against each other. And this is another thing that I realized before I started looking into this, their history. I think I had the impression that they were often at war with one another. and that, there was a lot of violence. And I just don't think that was the case. I think when they fought each other, it was on a very small and limited scale. But this Micmac War was a large war, and it engulfed the whole coast of Maine. And we learned from the journal, this quote is in Robert Davies' journal. We know that the Wawenock were fighting in the war because just randomly, the Popham colony settlers are out doing some exploring. They're on the Peshipscoke River, which we think was the Sheepskit River. And they just run into two of the two native men who had made it back to Pemaquid, to Hanado and Skikoweros, were two of the five who came back home. And they were on their way back from a battle in this war. So Samoset would probably been about 17 years old enough to be fighting in this war. And it would go on for years, as you can see. So during the very first battle of the Micmac War, which took place in Saco. So again, let's think about the Micmac coming all the way from Nova Scotia in their canoes to wage war in Saco. It's like, it rivals what the Vikings used to do, I swear. So it's incredibly impressive, their skills in the canoes. During that battle in Saco, the Micmac pulled out a secret weapon, which I'm sure you've guessed, was guns. Now they got these guns from the French. The French had built a little settlement in Nova Scotia, and they had befriended the Micmac, and they provided them with guns. They come down the coast and they use them in this battle, and all of a sudden the death toll goes sky high. They've never seen this many people die because a gunshot wound is a lot more lethal than an arrow wound. And I'll tell you, this just changed things forever. There's just no turning back. You can't compete in a battle when you don't have that kind of a weapon as well. So that brings us back to the Wawenock and the Popham colony. Why they wouldn't just run these people off? Because they've seen the battle, they know what guns can do, and now they know that they need them too. And the only place they can get them is from the English. So we can't just run them off. We're forced into this alliance because we need to get these weapons too. And this is really, in my mind, this is one of the most important things in the history between the English and the Wabanaki, and how this forced them into this relationship that they may not have wanted. Anyway, I'm just going to go back to the colony for a second, just wrap that up. Things go badly at the colony. They have a very bad winter. It's really frigid. As I said, they don't have enough food. The first president dies in February, and he was a decent man and treated the Wabanaki fairly well. But the second in command takes over. He's a young man who's brash, and frankly, he's racist, and he starts to mistreat the Wabanaki. And they had been helping them to that point, but now they stop. And this is obviously a problem because they needed them to get food, so they didn't have enough. So there are many, many reasons why the Popham colony fails, but the Wawenock do play a part in it. And I found that really interesting. So that fall, 1608, they pack it up and they go home. Popham colony's been a failure. And so it's just a footnote in history. Nobody remembers it, but they remember Jamestown. They were started at the same time, but that survived. So that's famous. So of course we know the English came back. It wasn't going to be the end of their coming. Pardon me. So it may have been a year or two later. We know that actually one ship comes back to Monhegan Island in 1609 because they kidnapped more Wawenock people. They kidnapped 2 more Wawenock men from Monhegan in 1609. But they decide to send fishing boats. They switch their focus. The colony thing didn't work out, but we know we can make money fishing. So they start sending fishing boats, and that works out fairly well. The Wawenock seem to tolerate this because they don't stay. The fishermen would just come for a short amount of time, maybe a couple months, to do their fishing and then go home. And they probably slept on their ships, but would come ashore to get some water, get some, firewood, maybe do a little hunting. They needed to dry their fish, which is what you see there. It's a fish drying rack. So they had to come ashore a bit. And they would also bring trade goods, because the Wabanaki and the Wawenock were starting to get interested in their trade goods. And they knew they could make some extra money on the side doing that. So they're starting to interact. And this would have been when Samoset would have gotten really comfortable with the English. And this is when he learned to speak the language, which is going to be very important, as you know. But as you also know, this contact, this closeness with the Europeans comes at such a great cost to the indigenous people, because they do not have the immunity to the diseases that Europeans carry. So this will cause a massive epidemic in New England, and it's called the Great Dying because it was really so horrible. It's believed that the death rate in mid-coast Maine was about 80%. So, I mean, just to put that in perspective, the COVID death rate worldwide is less than 4%. So the village of Pemaquid had about 100 people before the war and the epidemic. The population may have dwindled to 20, just to give you a perspective there. And, they had no idea what this was. They didn't know what caused it. They didn't know how it was spread. They didn't know how to treat it. I just can't imagine the terror that they lived through. They thought they had angered their Great Spirit. They thought that the Great Spirit was doing this to them. And then they looked around at the English, who were not dying. This just made things worse. Why weren't they dying? And they were quick to say, well, our Christian God is doing this to you and saving us. It just gives them this amazing psychological power over the indigenous people. What are they supposed to think? Anyway, and this, you will see, will cause so much trauma. Just, the death itself caused trauma, but for so many other reasons. There was so much loss of knowledge. When all those people died, all their knowledge, all their wisdom goes with them. I think it must have undermined their spiritual beliefs, because again, they just couldn't understand why their gods would do this to them. And of course, as I said, the Christians were happy to exploit that. And this would begin the massive displacement we will begin to see. The beginnings of why it's so hard to know what tribes lived where, because some of these villages would have so few survivors, those people would have to move and go to another village. So this was, I think, around the time when Samoset became the Sagamore, or the chief of Pemaquid, which means that he had a lot to deal with, of course. I mean, he had to help his people through the trauma. He had to help them recover. So I found this to be, I'll tell you, it took me a long time to actually put the pieces together and realize that this is when he leaves to go to Plymouth. And I was like, why would he do that? He leaves Maine in 1619, summer of 1619. As you can see, the epidemic is still going on. What would compel him to leave his people at that time when they needed him the most? Well, the answer is we really don't know for sure. I have ideas. And it's actually kind of a really complicated story as to how he ended up in Plymouth, which I can't go into all of that. But I found it fascinating that this was actually when he left, and he was gone for nearly a year. And he makes that famous walk into Plymouth Plantation. And I don't have time to go into the whole Plymouth story, which of course is very interesting, but just kind of want to set the stage for you for that walk into Plymouth. I never realized how dangerous a situation that was, and how brave Samoset was to do this, because he was well aware that this was a dangerous situation. So the settlers who migrate to Massachusetts, and they aren't called pilgrims till couple hundred years later. So I don't use that term, but the settlers came with the assumption, because this is the rumor floating around in Europe at the time, that all the native people in North America were cannibals. Now, this is what they thought. There's no evidence that the Wabanaki or the people of Massachusetts were cannibals. But this is what they thought. So first of all, I think we have to give them lots more credit for making this trip here, because how brave is that? I mean, they were faced with shipwrecks, which were common. They didn't know what they would be facing and had to build a whole civilization when they got here. And they thought they were facing cannibals. So, wow. And their first encounter that they have with indigenous people kind of bears this out. So they first set foot on shore in outer Cape Cod. That's where they first end up. And they send a scouting party to look for a place to build a colony. And then the men are attacked. One morning they're attacked by the local people, who are the Nauset. So this kind of bears out their fears that these people are dangerous and violent. Nobody's actually killed in this attack, but it has the proper effect because they leave the area, which is what the Nauset really wanted. And I'll tell you, the Nauset had a good reason for attacking them. And that was because 6 years before, another ship had come to their shores. An Englishman, captain, had befriended them, traded with them, and then kidnapped 7 of their people who were never seen again. So of course they assumed these people were going to do the same thing. Of course they were going to drive them away. So anyway, the settlers realized this is not a safe place to be, and that's when they move on to Plymouth, which was abandoned because the people who had lived there were mostly killed off in the epidemic. So they think, oh, great, this land's been cleared. God cleared this land for us. That's how they looked at it. But they didn't arrive in Plymouth until December. They had gotten a very late start to begin with. And the weather is terrible. They are so sick. They are suffering from malnutrition. They're suffering from many diseases, exposure. Half of them will die that first winter. Half of the settlers will die, which, makes them incredibly nervous and vulnerable. They know that native people are around them. They can hear them sometimes and they can see their fires, but the native people don't approach them all that winter. They're watching. They're watching, and they're trying to figure out what they're doing. And the settlers were so nervous that they would bury their dead in the middle of the night because they didn't want the native people to see how many of them were dying. They knew that if they were attacked, they couldn't possibly defend themselves. So that is how the whole winter goes. And then spring comes. And then you've got this man who just walks right into their village all by himself, right down the middle of their village, towards a group of men who are sort of clustered at the end. They probably have their muskets with them, I assume. This illustration doesn't show it, but he actually was carrying a bow and 2 arrows. So he's armed, and he surprises them. I don't know about you, but, given everything that they knew, they're thinking cannibals, they know they're violent. I think it would have been instinctive to shoot him on sight. I think that would have been my reaction anyway. And Samoset knew all of that. Because he knew about that attack by the Nauset. He knew what had happened. That was 150 miles away. Remember that communication network? They knew what was going on. He already knew that there'd been this violent encounter between them. He knew that the settlers responded by shooting at the native people. And he walks in by himself. But before they can even react, he smiles, he waves, and he welcomes them in English. I think it was probably the shock that saved him. Needless to say, this was quite a surprise. Samoset's never really received very much credit for his role at Plymouth. I'm guessing you probably just think, oh, he just walks in and that's it. That's what I thought. But he really deserves a lot of credit for what he did at Plymouth. Here's an intelligent man. He speaks their language. He's very friendly. He answers all of their questions, doesn't hold back. Whatever they want to know, he tells them. He's behaving in a very, very civilized way. Nothing like a cannibal, nothing like what they expected. This man is completely different than what they were expecting. And this immediately starts to calm their fears. They talked to him all that afternoon, and he's beginning to build trust with them. This is so important because he's laying the groundwork for this peaceful relationship that the Wampanoag people who live in the area want to have with the settlers. So it's Samoset arranges a meeting with Usamiquin. Now we call him Massasoit. That's because the settlers were confused. That's actually his title, because Massasoit means great sachem in Wampanoag. So when, the other men would call him Massasoit, they were calling him by his title, but his name was actually Usamiquin. And Samoset arranges this meeting. Now, you probably have all heard of Squanto or Tisquantum, who gets all the credit here, but they haven't even met Tisquantum at this point. Samoset is the one who's been working on both sides to work to make this meeting happen. And they come with the express purpose of creating an alliance with each other. So their very first meeting, they sign a treaty together. That's because Samoset's done all the groundwork. So in this meeting, they actually sign a treaty. I mean, Usamiquin puts his mark on this treaty, and they agree to be friendly with one another. They also agree to come to each other's aid if they're attacked by an enemy. And that was what was important to the Wampanoag, because they had been so devastated by the epidemic. Their numbers were very low, but their neighbors, who were the Narragansett, had been protected by Narragansett Bay. The epidemic never crossed the bay. They never got sick. So now the Wampanoag are in a vulnerable position, and they recognize that they could probably use the help of these people who've got these very powerful weapons that might help them against the Narragansett. So that's why Usamiquin is seeking out this alliance. And this peace treaty would actually, I know, it was shaky, of course, at times, but this peace would last throughout Usamiquin's life. So decades later, they managed to live together in relative peace. Samoset made it happen. Anyway, after he helps them negotiate that treaty, we don't hear more about him in Plymouth because he's probably gone back home to Pemaquid. And this is my theory about why he may have gone to Plymouth in the first place. 2 years later, we'll hear about Samoset again. And we know that he has a wife and he has a baby son. So my theory is that, there was very little population left in Maine. If he hoped to have a family and repopulate in Pemaquid, he may have had to travel south where the indigenous populations were much larger. So that's my theory. There's a lot more to that story, but I'm going to go with that. So Samoset returns home. They're still recovering from everything, and more people are starting to come. The fishermen are finding the fishing is great, of course, so they're coming in droves. But now you start to get these traders who come. And that's because the Wawenock are very interested in the trade goods that they have. Copper kettles are really nice. They don't break like their pots do. Metal knives and metal axes are nice and sharp, and they work great. And of course, they want guns and ammunition. And so the traders are bringing these things in. And now you start to see this tremendous change in their lives. Because before this time, they never hunted, trapped more than they needed for just their own comfortable living. They lived incredibly sustainably. Everything they harvested, they always planned for tomorrow. They always planned for the generations to come. They didn't deplete their resources. But now, with this trading, it's the only way to get those guns that they need. Now they have to do more hunting, more trapping, and it's the women who process those hides. So they're all spending time in this market economy now, and less time producing their own food. They're actually starting to trade for food at this point, which is a very new thing. And some of their interactions with some of these traders were kind of not great, as you can see by this quote. There's our friend Sir Ferdinando Gorges. He's testifying in 1624 before Parliament. And he's painting a very bleak picture of how some of these people are treating the Wabanaki when they come. They're sleeping with the women. They are pushing alcohol on the men. He says that they're teaching them to drink until they're drunk. So this is more than just giving them a little bit of alcohol. They're using alcohol to cheat them in trade. And he gives us an example of trying to pass off a block of salt as a block of butter. They just put a little butter on the outside and pretend that it's a whole block of butter. And then they are selling weapons to the Wabanaki, which is illegal by now. The King James I had made it illegal in 1623, but these are basically pirates. These are pirates. There's no law and order here. They can do whatever they want. They can sell, they can do whatever they want. So Sir Ferdinando says that the Wabanaki are beginning to become dangerous because they've learned how to use the weapons so well. And that is true. They depend on guns for their hunting very quickly. They give up their bows and arrows fairly quickly and become dependent on guns and become very good at using them. They surpass basically the skills of the English in using them. So anyway, I'm giving you a picture of some people who come here, men far from home, behaving badly. And it will begin to really damage. This is sort of the beginning. Well, no, obviously we've had some bad behavior before, but this will damage relationships with the Wabanaki, and they will remember these things for a long time. They will tell these stories for generation after generation. Now, I don't want you to think that all Englishmen were bad, because they were not. In addition to the traders and the fishermen, you start to see settlers coming. So by the mid-1620s, we've got settlers in Pemaquid. So now that's a different story, because if you're coming here with your wife and your kids and you want to farm some land, you're not an itinerant fisherman who's just coming and going and don't care about the relationships. Now you live side by side with the Wabanaki. They're your neighbors. You're going to get to know them. It's a personal relationship. And there are lots of stories about how warmly welcomed these settlers were by the Wabanaki. There are accounts of them working together. They might farm the same field together. So these early days, there were some really good relationships that came out of it, some friendships. And I hear those stories and I think, oh, that's heartwarming. And then in the next breath, I think, no, that's heartbreaking. Because it's just this glimpse into this world that could have been. I mean, for the first few decades, they got along in peace for the most part. I mean, obviously there are tweaks and whatever, but they are getting along. We end up with war and mass death and displacement, and none of that had to happen. It was not inevitable. And I just want to point out John Brown, because he's important to Samoset's story. The Samoset deed of 1625 is notorious. John Brown came to the Pemaquid area in the 1620s. He was a blacksmith. He came with his family, and he supposedly bought the Pemaquid Peninsula from Samoset. This is 120,000 acres, a fairly good sized land purchase. So if this deed is actually valid, then Samoset was the first indigenous person to sell land to an European, which isn't very notable. I'm not sure it's something he would necessarily want to be famous for. But there's a lot of controversy about this deed. And I didn't know about the deed much. As I looked into it, I came away with the feeling that the deed itself probably is a forgery, because there's so many red flags and shady circumstances that surround it. It disappeared right after it was, put forth. And anyway, I won't go into all of that. But my feeling is, either way, I think Samoset probably welcomed John Brown and other settlers, because think about it. I mean, there aren't many Wawenock living living at this point. There aren't many settlers in early days. So there's lots of land, there are lots of resources. It's not like they're butting heads with each other. And they have different skills that they can use to help one another. I think that the Wawenock probably thought that, they would have access to some of their European goods if they lived there. It could have been a very good relationship. And I do just want to say one thing about the whole concept of land. Obviously, indigenous people had a different concept of land than Europeans did. Indigenous people didn't own land. That was a foreign concept. They didn't own the ocean. They didn't own the sky. They didn't own the land. Not like Europeans who, have a contract and put a fence around it. It was totally outside their realm of understanding and the way that they lived. And so my feeling is that, when you look at some of these early deeds, my feeling is that they probably thought that they were entering into some sort of an alliance. Hey, we'll share this land, we'll all share the resources, and you'll help protect us against our enemies. Because believe it or not, even though the Micmac War had ended years ago, they were still coming down and raiding on the coast. So they still needed some protection. And I'm sure that they thought that this would be a useful alliance to them. And Samoset, I'm sure, never thought he would have to leave his land. He signed more deeds that have never been contested, and he spent the rest of his life on the Pemaquid Peninsula. I'm sure in his mind, he didn't think, if I put my mark on a piece of paper, I'm going to have to leave. And that was the way it was in the beginning. They would put their mark on a piece of paper. They don't know what it says. They have to trust what the English person tells them it says is true. And then they just kind of went on living. But as years go by, more and more English come. They want to expand their farms. They're bringing cattle. Cattle need a lot of land to graze. And they start to want to enforce these deeds that they have asked the indigenous people to sign. And we know that this changes because the deeds begin to change after a couple of decades. You start to see that the indigenous people will put in the deeds things like, we would like still to have the ability to hunt and fish on this land or gather nuts on this land. So that suggests that they know they're not going to be able to stay on it at that point. So that comes many years into it. And again, this is going to provide a bone of contention, because the indigenous people are selling land because they need to, because things are going to get kind of difficult for them. And sometimes selling their land is the only way that they can get by. And unfortunately, this kind of obsession with land that the English had would be the thing that would destroy the relations with the Wabanaki. They basically wanted the land, and they wanted Native people to just disappear. And unfortunately, as we move on in time, get to the 1630s, 1640s, we're going to see that things do get harder for the Wabanaki. More hardships are in store. There's another epidemic. This time we know it's smallpox, which is a devastating disease. And maybe not quite as deadly as the first, but certainly if anybody was lucky enough to survive, it was, difficult to live with the results. It would often result in this horrible scarring, could cause blindness, which would have been absolutely debilitating. So you have them going through this whole another period of trauma. And once again, the English are immune. They probably had smallpox as children. They're not getting sick. Once again, it's this, psychological power over the natives. And they try to use this to get them to convert to Christianity. And I'm sure that some do, in their desperation. But again, it's just a very difficult time. And then they become affected by what's going on in England. They're never immune from what's happening across the sea. there's a civil war that happens in England in the 1640s, and this affects them greatly because it causes a huge recession in New England. The period before that in the 1630s is known as the Great Migration. And you may have heard of that because that's, if you do your genealogy and it goes back to some of these settlers, that's probably when they came, because thousands and thousands of people came. They were leaving England because they didn't like the king. They couldn't practice religion the way they wanted. The king was a bad king, and he was taxing them and going to war. So they were leaving by the droves. They were leaving by the thousands. And then, as you can see, in the Civil War, this is King Charles I being beheaded, the only English monarch to be executed by his own people, actually. So once he's out of the picture, people don't have to leave England anymore. Now they can practice religion the way they want. The parliamentarians take over the country. And so now all of the ships that used to come and bring people and goods have all stopped. This is a hardship for the Wawenock, which may have led them to use and overuse alcohol, which is a very sad part of the story, but it happens to many indigenous tribes, not just in New England, but Canada, all over, as you know. And it was really another weapon in the European arsenal. They would push alcohol on indigenous people. Because they could manipulate them that way. They could cheat them. They could use it to steal their land. They might get them drunk and then they get somebody to sign a deed, or actually get them to run up debt at the trading post by buying alcohol on credit, and then no way to pay off your debt but sell some of your land. So again, it's just another means of subjugating the indigenous people. Add to this that they're starting to overhunt their animals. I mean, there were so many animals here before Europeans came. They never thought it would be possible, but it did happen. It was getting harder to find deer and moose and bears and beaver. And this was their livelihood at this point. They depended on these things, but they are having trouble finding these animals now. And they have to go farther and farther and farther away to get them. So there's just so much pressure mounting on the Wawenock. By 1642, there's talk of a big uprising among indigenous people. It never actually happens, but those tensions never go away. We're almost there, folks. You've been so patient. Tensions finally erupt in war, as we know. The first war is 1675. That's King Philip's War. Samoset would have been dead by now. He probably died around 1653. And it might have been a blessing that he never saw how badly things went after his death, because things just deteriorated further and further until it was constant warfare, basically. And that was because it was always the same old story. The English are trying to get their land, and they are dealing with the indigenous people dishonestly and cheating them. And every time there's a war, there's a treaty, and then they break the treaties. So they can't be trusted. And indigenous people have to live by English laws, but they don't really receive English justice in the courts as a result. So just so many things are building up, and they are just tired of being treated as inferiors, as anybody would be. And the time had come to end it. And by the 1670s, they finally could. Their populations are rebounding after the epidemics, so there are more people. All the men have guns because they have them for hunting, so they have weapons. And I don't know if you remember at the beginning, I talked about them coming together as a confederacy to fight off the Mohawk. Well, they realize how strong they are as a unified force, and they come together to fight the English. And they win these first two wars. They're very strong. They chase out the English from Maine, all of Maine. I think Wells is like the only settlement that still has English settlers after King William's War, that second war. So they're very powerful. It doesn't last, unfortunately. They also make a bit of an alliance with the French. Now, it was interesting to me that when King Philip's War broke out, most of the tribes in Maine, they wanted to stay out of the war. They tried to stay neutral. They didn't want to fight. But there really wasn't an option for them because the English just didn't trust them. And they forced them to give up their guns. The Wawenock protested. They said, we're going to starve because we need these guns to hunt for our food. And that did happen. Some starved that winter, so that they came out that spring of 1676. What other choice do they have? Now they're going to fight. So they get caught up in the war, and that will continue. And as you can see, the map is really wonderful map to show you kind of that movement of people. And I was talking about the displacement at the beginning. And that's what happens. The English are moving them off their lands. They're forcing them out of their lands. They tend to either kind of be absorbed in some of the other Wawenock tribes, or they move north to Canada, which I found interesting. There are some mission villages that were built by the Jesuit priests, the French Jesuits. They are trying to Christianize the indigenous people, of course, but they're also trying to wean them off of alcohol. They know what a problem it is. And so the Abenaki groups feel that that is going to be a place of sanctuary for them. And they go there from time to time when they need that. And there becomes this strong relationship with the French throughout the next 100 years or so. And that's kind of, you'll see that there's a strong tradition of Catholicism too, I think, among a lot of Wawenock, and that's the reason why. But you can kind of see by this map why there are no indigenous people living in this part of Maine, whereas we still have the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Micmac still live at least on part of their ancestral homelands. I never kind of stopped to think about that before. And that was because the French did not force them off the land. That was the English way. Truly, they weren't happy until they moved them completely off the land, and they had a way of doing it. And that was through this policy of genocide that they came up with, which I don't throw that word around very lightly, genocide. In fact, it's not in my book because I learned about this after it went to Down East for publication. But the governments of New England came up with at least, I think it was 79 bounty proclamations against the Wawenock. These were scalp bounties. And I don't think you can read the fine print, and don't worry that you can. But this particular proclamation is from 1755, and it specifically targets the Norridgewock people, the Arrassagunticook, they were the folks around Brunswick, the St. John's tribes, which were the Maliseet, and then the Wawenock. So they were sending anybody who would capture or kill a Wabanaki person would receive money for this. So in 1755, a man's hostage, if he was taken alive, in other words, was worth 50 pounds. And that's about $10,000 in today's money. So it's a lot of money. He was worth 40 pounds, just his scalp. And they would pay 25 pounds for a woman or a child under the age of, or a boy under the age of 12. So they have scalp bounties on children too. It's pretty shocking when you think about it. I think the highest bounty that was ever offered was 500 pounds, so about $100,000. I don't know what else you can really call it, but genocide. And they didn't stop simply with the bounties. It was slash and burn warfare. They would send their troops to the area to try to capture, kill Wabanaki. They would burn down their villages. They would destroy their crops, their boats. They were just trying to force them off the land. They wanted to clear the land. Now, I put up this little film, Bounty. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's been actually played on PBS this month. This is a very moving documentary. It is the story of some Penobscot parents who take their children to Boston, to the old State House there, where these proclamations were made. And they tell them about these scalp bounties that were put on their heads. And it's very short. It's only like 9 minutes long, but it's incredibly moving. And I'm not going to, it's difficult. It's painful. It's painful history. There's no way around that, but I don't think because it's painful, we should ignore it. I guess I feel that Penobscot are trying to teach this to their children. I think we should teach it to our children as well. We all need to be working from the same set of facts. So we need to know the truth. We're not responsible for what our ancestors did, but I think we would bear responsibility if we refuse to learn about it. And that's the only way that we can do better going forward, is to know what really happened. And I know that the Samoset story, the Wawenock story, is unique to them, but I think you can probably see how it's rather similar to what happened to other indigenous people when Europeans came here to colonize. And I think the Wabanaki would want you to know that they are still here, that they have existed throughout all of this effort to annihilate them. There are Wawenock descendants today. They're hard to find. I have tried to find some. They got so dispersed, as did all the Abenaki. Some went to live in Canada, some went to live with some of the other Wabanaki tribes, but they're still here. And they're still fighting. They're fighting for their language. They're fighting to regain their culture, their sovereignty, which you know has been in the news, and the respect that they deserve, because I do think they deserve our respect. Anyway, I told you I would show you how to get to those links. If you want to watch the Bounty film or that TED Talk, there are links on my website, which is just jodybachelder.com. There's a link that says resources. And if you scroll down, you'll see that there are videos. And if you're interested, you can watch them there. So you've been very, very patient. Thank you so much. Woo! 100 years of history. Zoom. Yes, really, ma'am. I don't know if the audience can hear that. Can they hear that question? How do we teach small children? One of our members of our audience here has a young child. How young? 6 years old. Well, how do you teach this history to somebody so young? And I don't have a good answer for that. There are starting to be more books that at least describe the culture, and I think we got to start there. Okay. I mean, you're not going to tell a 6-year-old about scalp bounties and genocide. That's, you've got to work into this. Yeah. There are so many positive stories, it's not a bad thing to focus on those as well. But human nature is that people sometimes don't get along. What strikes me as so awful about our history, particularly, is that, this country's kind of based on this concept of greed and money, and this is where everything went wrong. But there's what's the book about sweetgrass, the new picture book?
Sweetgrass.
Not the one by Robin Wall Kimmerer, but there's a Penobscot, I think they're Penobscot or Pemaquid couple, young couple who have 2 daughters, and they've written a picture book because their children didn't see themselves in any books, and they wanted them to. And it's a sweet book about this little girl going out, I think, with her grandmother to gather sweetgrasses, which is what they used to make their baskets with. Okay. And so it's just, kind of starting to introduce the culture
that was here before us.
Yes. Okay.
And
is still here.
Whose land we live on.
Yes, because they still gather sweetgrass and they still make baskets. I mean, these things still go on today. And I think, that's the thing we kind of don't think about, but they are all around.
You might make your book into a movie, and maybe Sunlight Media Collective with Dawn would be interested in that.
Yes, that would be. I've always thought this would be a tremendous movie. Mm-hmm. It's a very dramatic story. There's so many dramatic parts to it. And actually, I'm writing a graphic novel for like middle-aged kids about this story, which I'm really excited about. I've never tried to write a graphic novel before, but it's really fun. And I mean, because I see this in a very visual way. And, and I can play with it a little bit more. I can make up dialogue and things like that. But I follow the basic story of what really happened. And so that's going to be a ways out. I haven't finished writing it, but there will be more. There are more and more writings that we can share, and programs And they're bringing it into the schools. And as Diane knows, it is by law has to be taught in the schools. We haven't done a great job at that. That's just kind of come up recently again, how we're not really doing a great job. And I think part of the problem, well, first of all, the teachers don't know this history, and that's not their fault because we weren't taught this history. And there weren't great resources for us either, but there's starting to be more books, more videos, films like Bounty for older kids. And there's a lot more, right, Barb? I mean, when you say
the book you were talking about is The First Blade of Sweetgrass, which we have in the library. And then last year, the library board created a land acknowledgement agreement policy, which is posted on this post right above Diane's head.
Nice.
And one of the things we made effort to do at that time is to go through the collection, especially the children's books, and remove anything that seemed offensive.
There is a new book. Do you have that one by any chance? By Chris Newell about the first Thanksgiving. Actually, Chris Newell, I asked him to read my manuscript before it was published, and he's terrific. He was the director of the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor at the time, and he was living in Connecticut, and he's back living in Connecticut now, but he's just a wonderful educator. And he wrote a book about Thanksgiving, and he's indigenous, he's Pemaquid. So it's a totally different look at Thanksgiving. It's the real story.
If you lived during the Pilgrim thing or Plymouth
Yes,
Thanksgiving,
yes.
yes, we have that.
Yeah. He asked if Samoset may have learned English also from the two Wawenock captives who returned to Pemaquid. That's certainly possible. Yeah. I think he tells the settlers in Plymouth that he learned from the fishermen or from, yes. And I love that. I mean, there's so many wonderful stories about him actually, but when he's talking to the settlers, he's name dropping like crazy. He's telling them everybody he knows that comes to fish there. I know this sea captain and this sea captain. I know, and he knew about Sir Ferdinando Gorges. This is one of the most famous men in England at the time. And he knows who he is because Skikawaras had lived with the man. So, I mean, the connections are, to me, fascinating. They're really fascinating. There's so much, their lives are so affected by everything that's going on in England. It's uncanny kind of.
What was the first epidemic? You mentioned smallpox as a second.
I don't think we know.
Okay.
I tried to figure that out. We don't know for sure. It might have been more than one disease too.
Something that the English settlers brought. because-
Definitely. And possibly the French.
Yeah.
There had been a French shipwreck in Massachusetts, and there were survivors, and that was right before the epidemic also hit. So they may have carried diseases. It's coming down the coast. And you've got all this interaction. I mean, I think I came up with the idea that it might have been a strain of smallpox, but the reason we don't really know is because there weren't many Europeans on the coast writing at that time. So there's very little evidence. There are three pieces of evidence that we have are that one person mentions yellowing skin, another person mentions headache, and another person mentions sores. And if you try to put those three things together, they don't really come up with one disease, and one disease that would have such a high death rate. Because there's some diseases, like there's some jaundice or whatever, there's some diseases that can cause these things, but they wouldn't kill that many people. So it's really hard to know. I mean, everybody's still debating what killed them. I don't think we'll know. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious how you did your research and spent 5 years doing it.
Why did it take so long?
Where did you find information like this?
Well, you know what? You know what I started with? I knew that he walked into Plymouth, and I knew there was a deed, and that's all I knew. So it wasn't much. You start to read history books to get your bearings. You need to know what's going on besides just what's happening with Samoset, because you need to know the context of everything that's happening around him. So, read lots of books about the time period. And he does appear in the historical record more than once. The Plymouth settlers write quite a bit about him. I had never read William Bradford's journal before. It's actually really quite interesting. And another guy, there's another book. It's thought to have been written by Edward Winslow, another one of the settlers. And that's interesting too. I mean, and they don't tell you a lot, but if you can begin to sort of read between the lines of what was really happening. So we learned so much from that. And then 2 years later, there's an explorer that comes to the coast of Maine. His name is Christopher Levitt, and he also writes a book. And they would do this. They would write books because they needed to prove to other people why these ventures will work, so that they'll give them more money and then come back and do this again. So this was the pattern. They would write these books to sort of sell this place. So Christopher Levitt writes a book, and he talks about Samoset. He meets Samoset. He's meeting all these very important sagamores all along the coast. They've all come together in the Boothbay area. So they've come all the way from Penobscot Bay, Casco Bay, and they converge, and he meets them all there. There's a whole bunch of them. I mean, the mobility is incredible. How far they are all traveling at that time by canoe. It's incredible. So he appears, and you can glean things from that. You begin to see a personality come forward. And yeah, I mean, and then you put the pieces together. John Smith, famous John Smith, Pocahontas, comes to Maine in 1614, and he goes to Monhegan to go fishing, and he writes an account. He meets Tahanado, that other sagamore. I mean, and it puts it's like this huge puzzle of putting together these little pieces, and you're just grabbing them from here and there and everywhere. There are not a lot of accounts, and of course they're all written by English or French, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. There was no writing, indigenous writing. Everything for them was oral accounts, which, because of so much death, so little has survived. So, we're learning this from obviously the European side of things, but I mean, you just begin to put the picture together. Does that answer your question, Barb?
Does.
Yes, ma'am.
Another question, or writing it down on a piece of paper.
Yeah. Well, the question is, how did the deed business start? I think it was because they offered them something. In that 1625 deed, which we don't know if it's accurate or not, but the Wawenock were given 50 skins. That's supposedly what they sold the peninsula for. Now, okay, that's a red flag to me, because they had skins. It didn't seem to me something that they needed. Of course they were valuable. They could be used sort of, to use to trade with. The next deed that I know of, and there are probably many others in between, is when the town of, I think it's Woolwich, gets sold also to John Brown. John Brown moves around and he buys a bunch of land. He buys the whole town for something like 20 pumpkins. So, I mean, I try to imagine the situation where these things could happen. And if, how much do they actually understand each other? And I'm thinking, if John Brown says, oh, hey, I'll give you, a bushel of corn, and I'm going to give you all these pumpkins. Great. Thank you. Put your mark on this paper. So they are receiving something. And in a lot of early deeds, it looks like they're not receiving anything at all. It might say this is like a gift, but that's probably not true either. If the compensation isn't mentioned, they're probably receiving guns or alcohol. It was illegal to sell both of those things to indigenous people, so they're not going to write it down in a deed. They're not going to put that out there, because that would be illegal. But that is also probably what exchanged hands. So, what's the understanding there? We're going to let you fish and farm on these lands, and you're going to give us these guns. Great. As I said, it's not a problem in early days, because nobody's being moved off their land and their lives aren't being that affected. But it's when but it's when they start to really enforce the deeds and say, no, I'm going to put a fence there and you can't do that anymore. Or they start building those dams. They're doing that really early. 1640s, they're building dams. And now, they depend on those rivers for their fish. And that becomes a really big bone of contention because they're blocking the fish from getting to the lands that they've been moved off to. So if they've been pushed a little farther north off their regular land, now the fish aren't getting to them anymore. So, I mean, they're just, it's just like this sliding slope of dealings with the Wawenock that, at first it's pretty good. And then, the dealings just get worse and worse. And they don't have a lot of power at that point. They, as I said, all those hardships, another epidemic sweeps through. They don't have a lot of people and they're weak at first. They've been terribly, terribly weakened and they're getting outnumbered. What would you do? And I always think every decision that they make because this is our best chance of surviving. In my mind, that's got to be their number one priority. Why does Samoset sell some of this land? Well, he must get something that's going to benefit his people. Or why would you do it? They need this. They need that.
Fight it, fight, yeah.
Thank you for coming.